Good morning. I'm Diane Griffin, and the Vice President of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's my real pleasure to be able to introduce to you this morning's speaker for the book and author talk. So, Margot Lee Shetterly grew up in Hempstead, Virginia, where her father worked for, was a scientist at NASA, and her mother was a professor at Hampton, Virginia, I guess, Hampton University. She graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in commerce and has had a multifaceted career. We're going to hear about her part as an author today, but she worked in investment banking, lived in Mexico, and produced a magazine for basically expats living in Mexico. But then has done the research that we're going to hear about today for an extraordinarily successful book, and as many of you probably also know, movie, which actually I think came out before the book was published. The book's won many awards, but most important to us is that it won the Academies Award for Communication in Science for the best book. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Margot Lee Shetterly to talk about her book, Hidden Figures.
Thank you, Diane, for that introduction. And I really want to thank again the National Academies for having selected Hidden Figures for its 2017 Communications Award. It was an honor to be recognized and to stand here back in September. And it's wonderful to be here again and to talk a little bit more about the history of this book, which recounts the story of 4 black women working as mathematicians at NASA and at its predecessor agency, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, based in Hampton, Virginia, which is where I grew up. There are a number of things that have made this story, I think, appealing, and it's interesting for me to have kind of known this story and then to have watched so many people find something in it for them, and I think there are a number of reasons. It is a deeply American story, and the American dream is in the subtitle of the book. That was very intentional. But it's really an American story with a twist, because this is a story of people who are usually relegated to the background of history, helping America achieve one of its greatest successes. At the same time, they're pushing our country to live up to our founding ideals of equality and justice and democracy. This is a space story, but the astronauts are in the background of the story. They don't play a starring role. And it's a civil rights story that doesn't star Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's a science story which is told from the perspective of black women who, in our popular perception, are probably the least likely to be identified as scientists. And it's also a story about female mathematicians when everybody knows that girls can't do math. That is a joke. So Hidden Figures really offers a series of surprises. That's another part of its appeal. It was certainly surprising for me to learn this history, even having grown up around it. And I think that, who doesn't love learning these unexpected aspects of stories and the people that are around us and that we know. There we go. So Albert Einstein, whose memorial is located here on the grounds of the National Academies, he is arguably history's most famous scientist. And in fact, he's really become our archetype of a scientist, the wayward hair, the dreamy gaze, the rumpled clothing. But really digging into the person behind that persona, it also offers some surprises, because the man who introduced the theories of relativity to the world was also a very fierce advocate for human rights and for civil rights. And he was really willing to raise his voice during that time in the 40s and 50s against the kind of segregation that was the daily reality until the 1960s for African Americans, including the women that I write about in this book. And as a scientist, he also warned about the threats that human-created technology posed to the future of life on this planet. And at that time, it focused on atomic weapons. Einstein really spoke out despite the possible risk to his career and to his personal freedom as an immigrant. One of the things that I learned is that he was surveilled by the FBI. And if you go to the FBI website, you can actually download the extremely comprehensive file that they maintained on him during his time here. Really, quite a fascinating bit of our American history as well. But you can see here, I was here with my selfie with Einstein, which was really exciting. And what I thought I would do today is to really frame this discussion through the lens of Einstein and through that memorial. In addition to the equations that represent his greatest work, which are inscribed there, there are also quotations that really speak to his vision of the world and of humanity. He was a man of the same era, so I think there's a lot of resonance with the story that I wrote. It was interesting to me to read his writing and work on this story. And he was really wrestling in a lot of ways with the issues at the core of this book. And so the inscriptions on the memorial, I think, also do a very good job in capturing the spirit of the women that I wrote about, because they gave their minds to science, the exploration of the natural world. But they were also really committed to improving the human world. The other thing, I know that probably a lot of people have seen the movie. I know that more people see movies than read books. It's sort of a dream come true for somebody, an author, to have your book made into a film, but there's usually a lot that gets lost in transforming the book into the movie. And so it's always enjoyable to really talk about the long history that's sort of behind what's become now popular history. So the first quote is here: as long as I have any choice in the matter, I shall live only in a country where civil liberty, tolerance, and equality of all citizens before the law prevail. So Einstein became a U.S. citizen in 1940, and this was at a time when our country was on the cusp of going to war with Germany. He was a native citizen of Germany. He was Jewish. Obviously, there were atrocities underway in that country. One of the reasons for the war. But at the same time, here in the United States, we were falling behind, still behind on our fight for democracy at home. Black Americans were still subject to racial violence, to segregation, and to a denial of the guarantees in our founding documents. In 1941, something happened that really pushed forward a number of these issues. A civil rights leader named A. Philip Randolph, somebody whose name has really been lost to history a little bit, but he was the head of the largest black union in the country, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And through organizing, through the threat of a march on Washington that actually never happened, he was able to push then President Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 8802, which basically desegregated the civil service, which is something that had been segregated under the administration of Woodrow Wilson, effectively shutting out African Americans and a lot of other people from civil service jobs. So with that executive order in 1941, it opened the door for the women that I wrote about to take these positions as mathematicians. Obviously, it was also quite a practical measure because as America entered the war, the demand for labor, the demand for technical labor, for defense industry, people who could fill those jobs, skyrocketed. Now here, this is a memo that I found in the archives, the National Archives of NASA, its predecessor agency, the NACA. And this is a memo from Melvin Butler, who was the personnel officer, asking the War Manpower Commission to send them as many people as they could to fill the following jobs, including computers. So the laboratory, the Langley Laboratory, as it was then known, it's now called the NASA Langley Research Center, but it was founded in Hampton, Virginia in 1917. And from 1917 and through the 1920s and 1930s, the airplane really got its footing as a technology. And with that came the need for greater computing. And by the time World War II came along, obviously the need and demand for aircraft skyrocketed. The Langley Laboratory was working on a 24-hour schedule, like many of the other war industries, 3 8-hour shifts. And so Melvin Butler was doing his best to fill those jobs. And among those, the people who came to the laboratory during this time were Black women. Now, this is an article in the Norfolk Journal and Guide, which is a Black newspaper based in Norfolk, Virginia. The Black newspapers were instrumental in terms of advertising these jobs, making the Black community aware that these jobs existed, encouraging them to apply for them. And Black colleges also played a role. So Hampton Institute, it's now called Hampton University, it was then Hampton Institute, historically Black college in Hampton, Virginia, hosted a number of war training classes and invited people to come in to get trained. They would then take the civil service exam and qualify for jobs. Now, among those women were these women who were the first West Area Computing trainees. West Area Computing was the name of the segregated Black organization at NASA Langley. And so they took physics, they took chemistry, they took mathematics, sort of a very intensive STEM course. They took the civil service exam, and based on their scores on the civil service exam, they were then extended jobs over at NASA Langley. Now, this is really kind of an interesting slide. So I just want to give a shout out to a woman named Mary Gaynor Hurst, who was the Cultural Resources Officer at NASA Langley, and who for years did an amazing job of saving these old documents, photos, everything that really documented the history of that laboratory. And this is one of the photos that she found. The thing that's really extraordinary about this, so this is in November of 1943, the Secretary of the Navy came to visit NASA Langley, it was the Langley Laboratory at the time. The thing is, the Navy and the Army Air Corps were clients of the laboratory. They helped refine planes, design planes. The NACA was really responsible for the perfection of the P-51 Mustang aircraft. There's an aircraft called the Douglas SBD Dauntless. It was a dive bomber, and that was very instrumental in the Navy's victories in the Battle of Midway in the Pacific. So the Secretary of the Navy showed up. All of the employees filed into the largest building there, which was the Structures Research Laboratory. The thing that's really amazing about this photo is that it really challenges our idea of what the workplace looked like. And this is in Virginia, still segregated in the South in 1943. When you look at the detail, so you've got white men and their suits, executives. You've got a white man and his coveralls, obviously laborer, mechanic, white women in the front row. There are Black men over here on the side. Now, the Black men had been hired from the beginning of the laboratory, though they were hired as janitors, as laborers, as mechanics aides. Professional Black men didn't come until the 1950s, hired as engineers. But if you look in the field here, you can see the faces of some of the same Black women, Mary Cherry and Mabel Stiles and Thelma Stiles, people who were in that first photograph, that 1943 photograph on the Norfolk Journal and Guide article. So this was in November of 1943. In the next month, Dorothy Vaughn, who was working as a math teacher in Farmville, Virginia, and many of these women actually came from working in Black and white, came from working as public school teachers. They were math teachers. In December of 1943, Dorothy Vaughn left her job in Farmville. And this was one of the most remarkable moments of my research, was discovering in the Norfolk Journal and Guide this little snippet talking about Dorothy Vaughn leaving the high school and coming to Langley Field, and really thinking, like many people, that she was leaving for a temporary war job, not knowing that even after the war ended, she had really found not just a job, but a career, and she stayed there at Langley for the rest of her career. The original head of West Area Computing was a white woman who had come from the East Area Computing. This was, the women did the same work, but they were racially segregated. But Dorothy, in the late 1940s, eventually became the head of this segregated group. Now, Obviously, with the Jim Crow laws of the South, racial segregation was the norm. It was also the norm here in the Langley Laboratory. You can see here 1947 floor plan showing the colored dining rooms. You can see colored bathrooms for women and men there at the bottom. So this was a daily reality, regardless of the fact that they were scientists working on the cutting edge of aeronautical research. This was still their daily reality. The other thing about this, though, is that it wasn't just the racial differences that they had to deal with. They obviously also had to deal with gender issues, and this was something that applied to all of the women at the center. The women were hired as sub-professionals. That was literally a category in the government ranking. You were an SP1 or SP2, and that meant that the women could be paid less, even if they eventually went on to do the same work as the men. They had fewer opportunities to advance, and one of the things that was particularly difficult in the beginning was getting their name on research reports, getting credited for the work that they were doing. One of the things that was kind of a really interesting, really sort of humorous part of the research, the employee newsletters have all been digitized from 1942 through the present. So it's an amazing snapshot of life and culture at the laboratory. One of the things that I found was this satirical letter in 1945 to the new employees talking about what to expect at their laboratory. The place was building facilities like crazy, kind of coming out of this really wooded area. So they told them to bring sturdy shoes, make sure your insurance is paid up because you're probably going to break an ankle on the way to work. And then one of the funniest lines, but kind of interesting, from that was, "And woe unto thee if they shall make thee a computer, for the project engineer will take credit for whatsoever thou doest that is clever and full of glory." But despite all of those barriers, the women were no less captivated than the men by the work that they were doing. And this was really clear to me in the interviews that I was able to conduct with women who are, now in their 80s or 90s even. And they loved what they did. They were really, their imaginations were really open to this new world that they were walking in and really helping to build. And so I think this quote, and I really had to search a little bit to find the entire quote on the statue. And this is actually from a 1934 essay that Albert Einstein wrote called "Is There a Jewish Point of View?" And the full quote is, "But the Jewish tradition also contains something else, something which finds splendid expression in many of the Psalms, namely a sort of intoxicated joy and amazement at the beauty and grandeur of this world, of which man can form just a faint notion." And while this was an essay on being Jewish that he was writing about, there's no question that this is a transcendent emotion, and one that applies to us regardless of background, regardless of gender. And this is definitely something that these women felt. They were very strongly interested in exploring the natural world, and they saw themselves, had very strong identities as people of science. Now, this is Pearl Young. She's the first female professional at the laboratory. Now, this is just 5 years after it was established. She was a physicist. She was hired in instrument research. She came from the University of North Dakota, Phi Beta Kappa, in physics, chemistry, and mathematics. And one of her great contributions to the organization was she was the first technical editor, and what she really understood is that the NACA was an organization not just committed to producing new knowledge, but communicating that knowledge. The military services were stakeholders, the aircraft manufacturers were stakeholders, universities were stakeholders. It was really important for the NACA to communicate their findings effectively among all of those people. And she really set up a set of technical standards that you can really still see in the research reports of the NACA today. This is Virginia Tucker. She came in 1935 with 4 other women. This was the first computing pool. So this was a time when, again, the needs for aeronautical research and thus for computing power was increasing. The women came as an experiment. It was really, the idea was to set up something like a clerical pool where you could dole out the work among many people and make it more efficient. Turned out the women were really good at it, and after 1935, they began a systematic program of hiring women. Now, Virginia Tucker, she was there from 1935 through 1946. By the time she left in 1946, more than 400 women had gone through the computing training under her organization. And she left after the war to become an engineer at a little startup company called Northrop in California. Now, again, getting your name on research was something that was really difficult, and it took a lot of digging in NASA's National Technical Report Server, which is amazing. I mean, basically all of the research that has been produced by NASA since its beginning, and the NACA since the beginning, is there, available for anyone who cares to look. And so, but it took a lot of digging to figure out when women really did start getting credited with the research. And the first woman that I found was Doris Cohen, and Doris Cohen was a mathematician. She was, also involved, obviously as they all were, in aeronautical research, particularly airfoil theory, so really understanding the shape of wings and how to make wings more efficient. I found 9 research reports. She was there started in 1941. Then she actually went to NASA Ames, so she stayed in the NASA system. And she produced 9 reports on airfoils and stability of airplanes as well. The thing about her, that she produced this book. So the thing about her, she actually was the wife of someone who was quite well known, whose name is Robert T. Jones, R.T. Jones. Anyone who knows about aeronautics has probably heard of R.T. Jones. He's extremely well known, but she much less so. But they were collaborators during the 1940s and 1950s and produced this research report. The thing about R.T. Jones that also was very interesting, he was the head of a group called Stability Analysis. And going through the research reports of that particular group, I found that there were a number of women who had been credited with research. And in fact, there were a couple of papers where I found several reports in the notes that had either been solely authored by or co-authored by women. So this group that he headed was certainly a very good place for women to get credit for their research. Now, the first black woman that I discovered who got credit for research, she was also in R.T. Jones' Stability Analysis group. She had started out as a West Area computer and moved into his group. And the thing about her is she was sort of the answer to a mystery. I found a memo in the National Archives, 1951, talking about a black woman who was a GS-9 aeronautical research scientist. Well, this was pretty amazing. I mean, that is a relatively high ranking for a woman. I looked at a lot of the other, rankings and the personnel, the people at that time, and that was quite unusual, particularly for a black woman, and I couldn't figure out who it was. Eventually, I was able to identify her as Dorothy Hoover. She was somebody who went into this group. She published 2 research papers. This one is from 1951. She eventually left the Langley Laboratory. She went back to the University of Michigan. She started graduate studies. She didn't finish graduate studies, went to work at the Weather Bureau, then eventually ended up at NASA Goddard. And I think, the thing about her and the work that she did and looking at the arc of her career, she was really more interested in science and math, sort of more theoretical science and math, than applied math and engineering, which was really the bailiwick of the work at the NACA and at NASA. So, the thing I found, even the phone book. At the time, the phone books would publish your occupations, and so there was Dorothy Hoover in the late 40s and 1950s in the Newport News phone book as aeronautical research scientist. Now, this photo, originally, this is another photo that came from the NASA Langley archives. Originally, it only had a caption that said, "Women Scientists," no names on it. 1959 women scientists. And Mary Gaynor posted this on the Langley website in order to kind of crowdsource and find out the names of these women. Now, they weren't all technically scientists. Really, these were women who, were like GS-10, GS-11, women who had very high rankings there. But some of them were scientists, some of them were engineers, others were mathematicians. But a number of them went on to do, play quite a significant role in the space program, particularly Dorothy Lee, who was standing. She went on to run a number of engineering teams that specialized in thermodynamics and heating, reentry heating for aircraft or for spacecraft coming back into the Earth's atmosphere. Now, Katherine Johnson, I think probably most of you at this point have heard of Katherine Johnson. She is, I think, the most well-known of all of the computers and women who have worked at NASA at this point. And she still lives in Newport News, Virginia. She will be 100 years old this year. The Langley Laboratory celebrated its centennial last year, and she will be celebrating her 100th birthday this year. And Katherine Johnson, she was a math prodigy from the very beginning, one of these people who was just exceptional and passionate for math. I mean, she talks about counting everything that came into view, whether it was steps or dishes, skipped ahead several grades in school. And she was actually one of 3 students that integrated West Virginia University in their graduate school in 1929. She eventually decided to get married. She left graduate school. She had a family. She went back to school as a teacher. And she eventually ended up at the Langley Laboratory in 1953 after hearing about these jobs from a relative. Now, some of the things that, everybody talks about, okay, the book versus the movie and what were some of the differences. Well, Katherine Johnson actually went into a group called the Flight Research Division. In the movie, it's the Space Task Group. This Flight Research Division was one of the key feeders for that Space Task Group, but she was in this group, Flight Research Division, which was devoted to analyzing airplanes in free flight as opposed to looking at model airplanes in tunnels or large full-size airplanes in tunnels, which was a great part of the work at NASA Langley. The other thing in the movie, one of the other things, you notice that there's this whole subplot in which she fights to get entrance to the research meeting where all of the work is happening. Well, that is a true thing. She really did push to get into these meetings and asked over and over and over again until she wore down the engineers and they said, "Fine, enough. Come into the meeting. It's great." The research report in question in the movie is something called Notes on Space Technology. Now, that is actually a real document. In 1958, after the Russians sent up the Sputnik satellite and the NACA became NASA, everyone in the newly formed NASA was trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to go to space? What do we need to do? Well, there was a series of lectures that the engineers presented internally in which they discussed everything from trajectory analysis to reentry heating, celestial mechanics, everything that they needed to do to educate themselves to make this project a success. And so when I interviewed Katherine Johnson, in the early days, she would always talk about them having this group of engineers in the Flight Research Division and another group that was called the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division. Those were the 2 kernels of the Space Task Group. She talked about them having written the textbook on space. And for a while, I thought she meant it as a figure of speech. Of course, I mean, they wrote the textbook on space. They were the ones that pioneered this. But what she really meant was this document. It took me a while to understand that she was literally talking about a document that had been produced by that group. Somebody came to interview her, it's 15 years ago, more perhaps, and they looked at this. They came to her home, and they actually took this. She had an original copy of this Notes on Space Technology, and somebody stole it, basically, from her. So it took a while for me to locate a digital copy in the NASA server, and eventually was able to print it and give it back to her. But the real document that in question, where she became the first woman in this particular division to get her name on the research report, was this determination of an azimuth angle at burnout for placing a satellite over a selected Earth position. And what this does is it lays out the equations describing what is necessary to send a satellite into orbit around the Earth. And this is really the fundamental equations that they used to help develop John Glenn's orbital flight. Now, the final quotation here from Albert Einstein: "The right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true." And this really, for me, brought to mind the life and career of Mary Jackson, another one of the women that I wrote about. Now, Mary Jackson is from Hampton. Her family really, her family story, comes right out of the Civil War. When her parents, her mom was from Boston, her dad was from further upstate in Virginia, and they settled in Hampton after the Civil War. Her parents went to Hampton Institute. She was one of 11 siblings. They all went to Hampton Institute, greatly valued education, and also really had a philosophy of helping other people. That was part of what they believed in. Now, Mary, her first job was as a math teacher in public schools in Maryland. She came back during the war, and she ran the United Service Organization, the USO Club, the Colored USO Club in Hampton, Virginia. As she was the receptionist there, and then she took a job as an Army typist at Fort Monroe, and then finally applied for and was accepted for a job in Dorothy Vaughn's segregated West Area Computing Group. 2 years after that, she took a position at this is 1952, at a wind tunnel group called the 4-foot by 4-foot supersonic pressure tunnel. And she worked with a gentleman named Kazimierz Sarnecki. If you've seen the movie, the guy's name is Zelensky. It was Kazimierz Sarnecki. And Kazimierz Sarnecki really was her mentor. He really became a real booster of her career and eventually a collaborator. And over the course of her career, the two of them co-authored many research reports and really became close colleagues and friends. Now, Mary Jackson was as much of an evangelist for science and technology as you could get. And Mary Jackson, if there were new people who came to NASA Langley, she helped show them the ropes. She really believed in development of kids. She was a Girl Scout leader for all of her life. And she hosted an after-school science club. So she really thought that if kids can understand the beauty of science and of technology and of engineering from the time that they were young, they would really be captivated this, and they would be interested in pursuing this as a career. So one of the things that she did is she had an after-school science club, and what she had the club do was to build a wind tunnel and then build a model, and then test the model in the wind tunnel. So they really were getting, indoctrinated with the beauty of science from a very young age. And this was really one of Mary's truths. The other thing about Mary is that she really believed in equality as another truth, and really the equality of the Declaration of Independence, as in, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. She really believed in that. And what happened to Mary in her career, later in her career, she got to GS-12. She really topped out as an engineer. And she found that there were other women at the center at that time, this is in the mid-70s, who were having the same problem, that they were getting to a certain point and they were just not able to go anymore, regardless of their talent. And what she decided to do with the last 5 years of her career was actually to take a demotion. She moved back to GS-11 in order to go into human resources and become the Federal Women's Program Manager. And then what she did was to help other women. And not just other women. She also really spearheaded a program that would help blue-collar employees, whether they were secretaries, mechanics assistants, so a lot of men fell in that net as well, and enabled them to also get on a track where they could be managers and supervisors. engineers. One of the women that she helped and through this program was a woman named Gloria Champagne. Gloria, also from Hampton, Virginia, Hampton native. She came to the center in 1959. She was working in the Mercury Tracking Range office. This is the office that was responsible for setting up the tracking stations around the globe that would monitor these orbital space flights. Gloria moved up through a series of positions and eventually became the right-hand person, operations person to the head of the Space Systems Division. It was a position that had never been held before by a woman. And eventually, Mary and Gloria both worked and served on a number of committees devoted to women's issues there at the center. They got to know each other. And then when Mary was on the cusp of retirement, she spent the last few years as the Federal Women's Program Manager. She groomed Gloria. She said, listen, you're the one. I want you to be the one who stands in my shoes with this, with this position and to take over this work. And so, what the two of them would do is really interesting. So Mary had learned how to program as an engineer. They would sort of hack in, not quite hack in, they called it reprogramming. So they dig into these, at the time, state-of-the-art personnel computers that were designed to keep track of, everybody. They would pull out information, they would get all of the statistical information about the employees, and what they found was that even when a woman had the same performance reviews, the same educational background, and was producing basically the same work at the same level, she was not getting the same promotions as the men. So what Gloria and Mary would do was pull out this information, they would make the charts, they would go to the executives at the center, and show the discrepancies, and that was really the way that they opened the doors for a lot of talented women. Among them was Dr. Christine Darden. Now, Christine Darden came to the center in 1967. This was at the very end of the computing pools, which had sort of disbanded in terms of these all-female pools, but were still attached to engineering groups. And she had learned she had a master's degree. She went to Hampton University. She went to Virginia State, got her master's degree. She learned to program computers in college, and she came to one of the computing groups, which at that time in 1967 was really on the trailing edge. It was unlike what Dorothy Vaughan and some of the earlier women had come to, and they were still using these desktop computers. And she kind of felt like, well, I'm here at NASA. I want to move forward. I love this work. She eventually went to her division chief. So she basically went 4 levels up as a really young employee and said, I don't understand why it is that men are placed in engineering groups where they're allowed to do research, and women were still here in the computing pools. And the division chief was like, wow, I guess I never really thought about it, but here's your chance. And so that moment, that assertive moment, really was opened the door for her to have get her own engineering assignments. She eventually took some of the sonic boom minimization. That's really her field of study. So taking supersonic aircraft and minimizing that sonic boom that happens as they break through the sound barrier that we experience here on Earth. She took that theory and wrote equations so that you could then model it on computers. And this is something that's really still the core of a lot of the work that is done, still used today, in sonic boom minimization. So she was really, in so many ways, stood on the shoulders of all of these women and all of this history, and went and became an internationally recognized individual in her field. So this is, really, I want to leave enough time for questions. So you've just had the Cliff Notes version of the book. And again, I've spent a lot of time thinking about why this history has been so well received now. I mean, if anyone had told me that when I first published this book in September of 2016, that I would still be here in 2018 and people would be interested in hearing about it, I don't think that I would have believed it. But it is still a story that is quite relevant to what we are doing and thinking today. Decades after this story took place, we are still talking about many of the same issues. The strong demand for people who can fill jobs that are science and technology related, the composition of our science and technology workforce, the role of women in society and the role of women in the workplace, and the benefits and the risks of technological progress. And, but there's another thing that I do think contributes to the fundamental appeal of this story, and that is optimism. This is a story, you can't tell the story without addressing some of the very hard issues of racial segregation of our nation's history. And yet it's also a story of different kinds of people coming together to accomplish a goal, different kinds of people who are able to share a vision and an imagination of what the world might be, and a curiosity about the world is as it exists. Optimism seems very hard to come by in the world that we live in. We live in an age of political rancor, of economic anxiety, of cultural fragmentation, and technological overload. It's very hard to detach oneself from the constant barrage of information and news. But, the time of Hidden Figures, that was also a time of political rancor and economic anxiety and cultural fragmentation and technological overload. And the fact is, these women, despite all of those things, they never lost their belief that their work as scientists and their actions as citizens could lead to a better future. And so I found a final quote from Einstein. I think it's very much in that spirit. "We will hope that future historians will explain the morbid symptoms of present-day society as the childhood ailments of an aspiring humanity due entirely to the excessive speed at which civilization was advancing." Thank you very much.
I'm Roberta Morris, and my question is, who was so smart and wise and open-minded and also realized there was a good chance to exploit, who formed a black women's computing group? I mean, it's amazing that someone would think not only that women could do math, but that black women could do math. So I wonder if you know who it was and how it happened.
That I got very close to that. That is the smoking gun, right? So I always figured that at some point I would find the smoking gun, and there was the memo that said, we are going to start this segregated West Area computing group. And I never did, and I think there was, I got very close. So, I found the memos about ordering the bathroom signs and, obviously Melvin Butler's telegram, talking about we need all of these people. There were any number of supporting documents, but I never found that one document that said, as of this date, we are going to establish this group. But I think, obviously it was something, I think Henry Reed, who was the engineer in charge of the laboratory at that time, obviously had come to, Hampton. He was actually from Massachusetts. He understood, at that point he'd been there long enough to understand the sensibilities of a southern city. And so they didn't really publicize it. It was something that was obviously kept very quiet. And even after that happened, there were reports of, some of the oral histories of the reactions to this happening. And there were a lot of people who were extremely unhappy about it in the city of Hampton. I ended up talking with Melvin Butler's children, who said, listen, he was a progressive, particularly in the context of that time, a progressive person who was behind the scenes making a lot of these things happen, and who also behind the scenes recruited some of the first African-American engineers who came. And so I think a number of the people who were in charge of the laboratory saw it not only as a practical solution, which it was, but also something that was the right thing to do.
Make your way to the microphone.
Hi, I'm Ann Stone. I loved the book. I have a question, I guess 2 questions really.
Is your microphone on?
Does this work better?
Stand closer.
Okay, sorry. I have 2 questions. First, what was the biggest surprise to you? And are you continuing to work on this, or are you starting something new?
So 2 questions. What was the biggest surprise? The biggest surprise to me, honestly, was that there were so many women doing this. The idea that in 1946, Virginia Tucker, who was the head computer, was talking about already having trained 400 girls, as they were called at the time, as computers, was astonishing. You know, and then you think about the fact that there was NASA Langley, then there was NASA Lewis in Ohio, there was NASA Ames out in California. You know, that the NASA, or the NACA, the predecessor agency, continued to grow, and that required women working in computing. And so that really gave a lot of context to not just the work that was done at NASA, but the time. And there have been a lot of books that have come out. Rise of the Rocket Girls is one book about the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Code Girls has just come out about women that were working in cryptology. So this whole idea of women working in computing and supporting this research work wasn't an exception. You know, it was the default that women did that kind of work. And that was something that I simply didn't know anything about, that there were so many female mathematicians doing this kind of work. To your second question, there's sort of 2 things that came out of this research. One was really an effort to try and locate all of these women, you know, kind of really trying to put a number on the women and get a sense of the scope of the women that did this work, all of the women, all backgrounds. So I started something called the Human Computer Project, which I'm hoping to carve out more time to work on, which is really devoted to that, and that is understanding these women, their stories, the work that they do, and also coming up with some kind of quantitative information on their careers and their trajectory and them as a data set. The other thing is I'm working on a new book, which takes place mid-century, African-American protagonists, same time period as Hidden Figures, a lot of the same issues of social mobility and race and, you know, everything that was going on in this country mid-century, but with entrepreneurs as opposed to scientists.
Interesting.
Last question.
Ranger Morgan, talk to us a little bit about what I'm sure must have been at times a frustrating experience seeing your work turned into a major motion picture.
You know, honestly, when it is a dream come true. I mean, it has turned out as a dream come true. It didn't have to be that way, but it did turn out that way. But for a first-time author, I mean, this is my first book. To have the book published is amazing. To have it turn into a movie, to have it optioned for a movie, and then actually become a movie it's a very rare thing to have happen. And so I had a real learning curve to understand that this story that I had dedicated so much time and effort to, that started in 1943 and ended in 1969 with an epilogue that went to, you know, the 80s, that was not possible for a film. And the film producers made the decision to focus the story on this very dramatic moment when Katherine Johnson is involved in John Glenn's flight. I mean, that was absolutely the right decision. I mean, you get so much more drama by, concentrating it, but you also have to conflate storylines, you invent characters, there's a lot about the story that if you have read the book and you have seen the movie, you will understand that there are, some differences there. And it was really hard for me to understand that was a necessary process, that there's simply no way to make a good movie, something that people actually were willing to sit through 2 hours in a darkened theater without making some of those changes and making it dramatic. The thing that was really great is that from the very beginning, the people, the movie people, the producers and the director, the screenwriter, the actors, everyone who was involved took the movie very seriously. They spent time with Katherine Johnson. They came to Hampton. They went to NASA. They looked at the wind tunnels. They looked at all of the old photos. It was really important for them. They you know, I mean, obviously, some of the science is not exactly, some of it's not accurate, but then a lot of it is. You know, they really went out of their way. You know, like this whole part of unearthing Euler's method to solve these problems. You know, they kind of invented some stuff that didn't happen, but still was, you know, you could support based on some of the science and math. And so they took it seriously. I thought the movie was fantastic. And most importantly, the people who lived that history really enjoyed the movie. So it ended up being just an absolutely wonderful experience for me. Yeah, and yeah, relief.
Okay, well, let's thank Margot Lee Shetterly again for that.